Okay. Hello, I am Honorable Lady Serena Calandra. I'm in the Shire of Adlersruhe in the Kingdom of Onstiora. There may be some here that also know me from Amtgard as Calandra from the Golden Plains. And I'm going to be talking about how to make wire pins and fibulas. We have a lot of different examples here. And all the examples that I have here are based off of period examples. The handouts, I'm not going to be sharing them because of some of the material that's in it that I don't have the permission to show that in a recorded video. The links to the pins, there's a few examples of some pins, and then the other handout is my wire jewelry basics class. And it just has some basic things that are helpful with getting started with wire and jewelry, but also has some pictures that will show part of one of the pins that we're going to do. But I wanted to start off with talking about some of the materials that you would need to get started with making pins and fibulas. The first thing, of course, is wire cutters and pliers. There are many different types of pliers and cutters out there. So I'm going to show a few different types, and they cut differently. These right here that I'm holding are what are called full flush cutters, and they will cut to where the wire is going to be smooth on each side, or mostly smooth. So we'll demonstrate that. Be a little hard to see on the camera, but it's mostly flat. There's a little divot in the middle. Now, these can be hard to use when you're trying to cut something up flush against the back of a pin like this. But they do have their purpose if you're cutting it for cutting different pieces. What I prefer to use are what are called semi-flush cutters, which are these, that when you look at the back, that they're flat. And what these will do, it'll cut one side to have a little V and one side being flatter. And then you can always just switch it around and trim off the V end if you needed to. But with the pins, the V end is actually going to be helpful. And we'll get into that more as we get to where I tell you about filing the pin points to see how these cutters will be useful for that. Now, there are other wire cutters, the ones that generally when you buy most jewelry sets of pliers, usually you don't want to use those. They will leave both sides V, and sometimes they don't cut very well. So it's often good to look for a set that has this type of cutter, or buy an extra set of cutters to go with your pliers. As far as pliers, the most important pair that you need is the looping pliers, or round nose, as they sometimes may be called, that are like this. This is good for shaping your spirals and your loops. And then I like to have two other pairs of pliers. The main requirement is they need to be smooth jawed. You don't want any that have the grooves inside of them. As far as what type you use, that is a personal preference. It also depends on what gauge wire you're using, and sometimes just what type of shape you're doing can make a difference too. So I use a variety. These are nylon jawed. These are good if you're using colored wire and you want to protect it. This will help it from having everything get scratched off as you're working. I use some small pliers depending on what I'm using. So you have your flat. These are what are called chain nose. Some people will say needle nose, but also chain, as they're slightly rounded on the tips. These are bent nose. These are only slightly bent, but you can get some that are more bent. With some of the shaping of the pins, sometimes these are helpful. And if you're using smaller wire, it's better. And sometimes I just use a long needle nose plier. You can also do something else to protect if you don't want to use nylon jawed. This has a coating on it called Tool Dip. It's similar to Plastidip, and you dip your pliers into it and pull it out, and it creates a rubberized coating that can help protect your wire. This has actually been on this set for about 20 years, and it really could use a new dip in it, but it's actually still there. Uh, Another way that we did in college was using masking tape around the pliers, but that can leave residue that lasts on them. So it just depends. If you have an old pair that's causing lots of scratches and stuff, then putting masking tape on it will actually help things a lot. If you're working with just copper or brass, you don't really need to necessarily protect it. Just depends on how bad your grip is on things. And I grip things very hard. Okay. So that's the basics on getting started with your pliers. Some other useful tools with making your pins are going to be having a steel block or an anvil, because for a lot of these, you're going to want to work harden parts of it to make it stronger. This has a silicone base and then steel. I got this off of Amazon. I have this one that is a small jewelry anvil that you can find in many craft stores or places that sell jewelry supplies. And then this one is a steel block for the metal stamps. And you can find this in several craft stores as well. I don't like this one as much because the little feet come off very easily, but you could just take them off or add a new one onto it. I just haven't done that yet. My favorite is this one because it does give a good surface. And something else that can be helpful is having a piece of suede or leather to put over your steel. And because sometimes you're going to want to flatten your wire and sometimes you don't. So if you put a piece of leather down over it, it won't flatten the wire. If you're using a nylon hammer, such as this, these are going to be labeled specifically often as jewelry hammers. If you're doing a search, they have different types of heads that are supposed to be non-marring, so it doesn't scratch your wire. Versus other hammers, this is a ball peen hammer that is used largely for jewelry, because I do use this end too, depending on what I'm doing. And this will flatten the wire a little bit. I also use my chasing hammer sometimes, depending on what I'm doing. Now, all of these hammers you can find at most places that sell jewelry supplies, craft stores, Rio Grande, and also on Amazon. Okay, so for wire, tonight I'm going to be working with aluminum and copper. I find that those are cheap wires that you can come across easily. Many hardware stores as well as craft stores and Amazon to be able to order things. And when you're looking at wire, sometimes it will have hardness. It may list something as dead soft, full hard, or half hard. And for this type of work, dead soft is preferred for most things because it's easier to twist the wire. Sometimes you might be able to get away with half hard for some of the veil pin type pins because you're not twisting it a lot, but I wouldn't use anything that's half hard or full hard in anything bigger than 18 gauge. And I really wouldn't recommend full hard for most pins at all, other than maybe for a hat pin type thing. It can be difficult. The copper that I'm working with is going to be either 18 gauge or 16 gauge. I find that for veil pin type things, 18 gauge does tend to work okay. You can get by with 20 gauge if you're doing a lot of hammering to harden it. The other pins, you want a minimum of 18 gauge. For example, this is actually about 14 gauge or 12 gauge, somewhere in that range. And that creates a thicker pin. And this is good for heavier things like cloaks and shawls. I have used this on a woven cloak before, as well as this one. And it does actually hold, even though it is aluminum, because you can work harden it with hammering it. And what work hardening means is as you work it, it becomes less malleable. And that's the difference when you're looking at, when we're talking about the softness of the wires, is how malleable it is. And that's why you don't want to use full hard, because you need something that you can start off with that's easy to twist. Okay, so we're going to start off with the trefoil pin. This is the one where part of the steps are in the handout. Now we're only going to do 3 loops on this. So we'll stop at that point. For if you're wanting to craft along, I recommend starting with a piece that is about, oh, I apologize, back there. Okay. I'm going to start with a piece that is 7 centimeters. Now, how long you want to make things can vary depending on what gauge of wire you're using. And that shows one thing to do is to hold on to your wire or try to protect it as you're cutting it so it doesn't go shooting off. Okay. So for this one, I'm going to start with the looping pliers. And I am going to make 1 loop like that. Then I'm going to put my pliers near the loop, but not right next to it. There's a tiny little bit of space in there. And I'm going to turn to make the 2nd loop. Sometimes at that point, I'm going to take my other pliers and kind of even it up. So we have 2 points or 2 loops there. And then now I'm going to make the 3rd one, which, okay. There are different ways to do this. I have my preferred way of just how I like to have things look. So I have right here, if you look at it, I have the working end of the wire is going behind this bar here. I'm turning it so it's that way, so then I can make my 3rd loop on this side. And by doing it that way, it gives where the back one side is going to be flat. And then on this side, you have where it crosses over like that. And it makes it easier to lay against something by making the loops that way. So there you have the start of your pin. Now this point is where you're going to want to work harden at least the stem, but I try to hammer a little bit on the trefoil part as well. And this will make it to where it can't move as easily, and it'll be harder when you're trying to put it into something. So I do apologize, there will be some hammering. Now I like to flatten out my trefoil a little bit, so I'm going to use the metal hammer. And if I hammer on the edges like this, it will, okay, let's see. When you see that it's flattening there versus here where it's still round, This one has a better example to show how that one's been flattened out. And that's done, as I said, just by hammering the loop part. And then for my pin, I don't want to flatten that out, so I'm going to use an eyelet mount. And now this may take a different amounts of time depending on your wire. The general idea is just to hammer it a little bit on both sides to strengthen the post of the pin. Now, the other thing that you have to do to finish your pin is to cut your point. And this is where I like the semi-flush cutters. I like to cut a little bit at the edge and cut at an angle. And doing that in your hand will help make the wire not go everywhere. So it can be a little hard to see the point, but you can see there in the cut. It's a little easier on the bigger wire, so I'll demonstrate that on the bigger piece. So for all of the pins, this is going to be the same, of cutting it at an angle at the tip. So then you have the start of a point. You see that side versus the other side. And then the next step is to use metal files to file it. I have used a metal nail file before, but you can get these called needle files, or you can use bigger files if you have them. These needle files are great for jewelry, and they come in sets with many different shapes and sizes. Now, with filing, you want to file in one direction away from you. Some people do prefer to wear gloves when they're doing this because it can end up going on your nails or your hands. I like to wear cut resistant gloves for certain things. Some people use it with all the wire working. Eye protection, of course, is recommended as well. But you just file away from you until you have the point to where you want it to be. But cutting that angle helps get things started for the point for you. So this one I made a little short, but it could still have its uses for a decorative pin. I think probably working with 12 centimeters or 10 centimeters and then having extra that you can cut down would be a good start for one of those. Now for the other veil pin or hat pin type pin that I have, this is where we're going to learn to do spirals. And we'll use spirals in a few of the other pins. It's a very common motif that you find in period pins. So for this one, I'm going to use the larger wire because it's easier to see on the camera. And I'm going to start with about 20 centimeters. I have used this larger wire with this pin to make a hairpin, as I saw somebody else do that as well. Okay. So for the spirals, we start with the looping pliers. It doesn't matter whether you turn it down or turn it towards you, whichever is more comfortable for you. And I'm going to start by just make a little loop. like that. And now I need to take another pair of pliers to hold it while I'm trying to twist it. This is the part where it gets a little tricky sometimes to get started, especially with using the lower gauge wire. And if it's not completely rounded, that's okay. On this one, it's just a matter of preference of how many times you want to twist it to make your spiral. I'm going to twist it just a little bit more. So I have my spiral. Now I want to make my little loops off to the side here. Okay. There are different ways to do this. But what I like to do is to position my wire a little bit. I'm just using my hands to move it to where I have this slight bend here. That will help me get my loop in a better position. I don't want to bend it too tightly. It's just something to help get things started. So I'm using that bend to help make my first loop. Like that. Then I'm going to go to this other side here, the other side of the spiral, and I'm going to make my second loop. It doesn't matter whether the wire goes in front or the back. I have my different personal preferences on it, but the general idea is just trying to make two loops, one on either side of the spiral, like that. And then to finish that, you would do the same as you did with the trefoil and hammer whichever parts you want to hammer and hammer the pin, and then make your point and file to get that completed. Because you can see on this how bendable it is because this is aluminum. But if you hammer it enough, you can get it to where it's not going to bend as easily. This one probably could use a little bit more. But it has less give in it than it would if it was just straight. But it takes a lot of hammering with the aluminum to get it to where it's harder and can handle things. There will always still be some give, but you want to work hard in it some. Okay. So now that we've started with spiral, it's going to lead us into some of our other spiral pins. So this is one that you can find lots of examples of, the double spiral. Sometimes you'll find variations of it where there's loops in between. You also find ones that are single spirals with little loops. Or you have this one, which I will show this one in a little bit. This one does take a lot of wire. I find it's best to cut too much wire than to not have enough. So I am using about 38 centimeters is what I have cut here. So this one's going to be a little bit different with starting the spiral because on one end, we're going to leave the amount that we need to be our pin portion of the pin. And then the other one is going to be for the catch for the pin to go into, or the bar and the catch. It's another way to look at it. I am going to leave a little bit here. Let's see. It's approximately about 5.5 centimeters that I'm going to leave for the pin. And so to help mark to know which end I'm using for which, I'm going to take my plier and I'm going to bend it. And so I just made a bend right there because this is going to stay down. And then I'm going to take my looping pliers like this. So I have this is going down. This is going to stay straight. And then I'm going to make the loop to start the spiral by leaving this down. So you can see where it started like that. This is where it can get tricky and the types of pliers that you're using can make a difference. I like my bent nose. They're easy to get in here and get around the start of that spiral. And working easy to work around the pin being down here. I apologize. This is or I wasn't showing it very well because this is the tricky part with trying to get the wire to not hit the camera. Okay. And so you keep going. Till you have it to the point that you want it to be. And I'm actually going to cut a little bit off of it because I want to make this smaller. The advantage of cutting things bigger. Okay, so for the other side, we don't need to leave as much as we did on the pin side. Just need to leave about 2.5 centimeters, an inch or so. And so I'm making the bend down with that again. This wire is soft enough that I didn't need to use the pliers. I just used my fingers to make the bend to go down. Now for this spiral, you want it to twist the opposite direction of the first one. So in this case, that means I need to turn it away from me the way that I'm holding it currently. So think of it like you're making a giant S is what you're doing. It's just a really fancy S with a lot of spirals and twists on it.
That's at the top of the screen, a little bit off camera, but not much.
Okay.
There, that's better.
There, it gets a little tricky sometimes when I'm trying to twist the wire to make sure that I'm still here.
Yep, when you're holding the pliers, yep.
Okay. And this pair is being very not all that cooperative right now. So I'm going to use a different pair. This is where I also like these long needle nose because it can get into these small areas. Because when you're trying to work around the pieces of wire hanging down, it gets a little tricky trying to bend it. Sometimes if your wire is soft enough, you can just twist it too. And that is just fine. Whatever way works for you. And so you can twist it to where it goes up and meets like that. Or if you wanted to add the loops in, would leave enough room that you could twist it. So there's one loop. And then, sorry, I have to think about the direction there. I don't quite have enough. There we go. Just undo it a little bit. And okay, it gets all a little bent out of shape. You can manipulate how you have the loops. You can push them up together. You can pull things apart. This one got a little bent, but still makes for something fun. Now, as for this part, we can fix that. Okay. Now, hammering with these wires gets a little complicated. I have found for this one in particular that the jewelry anvil actually works a little bit better because you can get closer to be able to work harden it and work around that upward part, the post. And so I would generally recommend going through and gently hammering around the spirals because otherwise it can pull like this. So it's pulling apart. If you hammer it, then it won't do that as much. I'll still get a little bit, but not as much. There we go. That one's better. This one has been hardened in the center so that it doesn't come out as much. All right. Now for the fun parts. To make it look like this on the back. So you can see how one end is the pin or the post for the bar, and this is the catch for the clasp. So for making the catch part, I'm going to cut a little bit off because I don't need a whole lot. What I like to do is to make a little bend before making the loop, and that gives it a little bit more give. So I'm leaving a little bit of space, about a pliers width or a little bit more. I'm going to turn the wire out the opposite direction of where I want the loop to be. And then I'm going to take the looping pliers and make my loop. Now, how much you want to leave this up depends on what you think you're going to put it through. I actually think that this might be a little much for some things, so I could have cut it a little bit shorter. But I can also put a little bit more in the bend and create more definition on that. There we have the little, it's just a little hook. So it's not closed all the way. And then for the bar portion, I like to put towards the back of my looping pliers. It creates a little bit of a deeper bend and just gently fold that over. So it will go under things. And that actually tells me that I have my loop is up too high when it's trying to fight it to want to go into it. And so if I bend it back a little bit more, or bend it over, so it probably needs to be cut down a little bit. So that's one of those things that sometimes you just have to play with it to get it to where you want it. Now this is too much on the end, so this is where I would cut it off to start the point like we did on the other ones. So you can see how that just gently goes in and holds. So it's just a simple bar and catch system. And that's what we're going to use with a lot of these pins. Now for the next one is the fibula. Now this is the fun one where you can add beads or hammer it flat. There's one with beads. Here's one where I've just hammered it to give it some texture and dimension on that.
But before we continue, has anybody got any questions? You can unmute yourself. I know it's been kind of quiet. Everybody's very carefully looking.
And there will be time also after I go through these and we stop the recording. If you have anything specific you want to look at again or questions, we can go through that as well. Okay. This is where I need to get out something that will be helpful for molding things. Okay. You can use whatever you find around your house that might work. This is from a dapping block, which is used for creating concave things in metal. And for me, it gives the right width. I've used cups before, handles of my hammer. If you have a ring mandrel, you can use that, or whatever solid thing that's kind of a cylinder that you can use to wrap the wire around.
The wood baseball bat.
Yes, that would be good. Or a sword. Piece of rattan would work. Just don't want to hammer against that though. Somebody might get mad. Or PVC, that's another thing I have around that I've used. Okay, so for this one, it's not going to be completely half and half. I'm leaving probably I have about a third of it that I'm going to use for the pin portion. And so I'm just going to take the looping pliers and make a loop. Pretty much like this. So this is going to become my pin portion. And this is going to be the rest of the pin. So this will be the bar portion of the pin. Okay. So now we want to, this is where you can hold that loop with your pliers and gently just kind of form it. Kind of making like a letter D in a weird way is one way to look at it. This is where having something to wrap it around can help. That if you want to get a more rounded shape. And what you can do is take the mallet and gently hammer it against. I can't see what I'm doing. There we go. But you can hammer it against it to help work, harden, and form the shape. But if you don't have something to do, you can just do it like what I was doing with my hand and form it that way. Now, for the clasp portion of these, I like to hammer out to make it flat, and it gives it a wider surface on that, especially for these that are often used on heavier garments. And so how I do that is I'm going to bend my pin back out, and I'm going to take just a little section of this to flatten out. And you can see how that is flattened out and gives a wider area for your catch. And then you take the looping pliers and you make your loop to make your catch. You have to open it up a little bit. That's where I have to play with it sometimes. There we go. To get it to be in the right place. And then this is where, now if you're adding beads, you would do it before you put on, before you hammer the catch part. It's a similar concept. So you can see on here, on this one, I made the loops. Then I put on my beads. Then I just made another loop here and then went up and made the catch in the bar. So that second loop helps keep the beads from trying to come off whenever you set it down, because they will try to come up off over that loop part. Now, if you're wanting to hammer out this portion of the fibula, you just take your hammer Now, I mentioned the ball peen before, which is this part of the hammer. You can use this to create more texture and also creates more surface area that you could use to flatten it out even more. See, that creates a little difference in the texture. Now you could leave it just like that, or you could take a hammer to use it flatten out, and that's where this planishing hammer type thing works. It helps to smooth out the texture. But the reason why I would do that, though, is that when you use the ball peen portion, as I said, it creates more surface area, which allows you to get an even wider flat surface on here. Now, this is coated aluminum. If you hammer through it enough, it will start coming through. The aluminum portion will start coming through the coating with the anodized color on here. However, I've hammered this quite a bit, and you can still see that the coating is still on there. So with a lot of the anodized aluminum, you can really work with it and still hammer it out and still have your color on there. But it's always good to do a test piece first to see how it's working. I actually like it when it starts coming through a little bit, because then you get kind of, to me, it's more a rustic feel with it. You can use brass. I have had experience with brass wire, though, causing discoloration on some clothing. Same with copper. Just to caution that if you're using things on light colored fabrics, that sometimes, especially with age and the patina, as it patinas, it can rub off onto your clothing. So just to keep that in mind. So those are the basics of the pins to go through. And now I can go over this one, which I know is a favorite one. Now this one gets a little bit complicated, but it starts off a lot like this pin. So I'm going to show that with the big. Now this one eats up a lot of wire. Just to caution with that, it is good to cut extra wire than you think you'll need. So this is actually a really big piece. It doesn't even fit all the way on my camera. So this starts with the loop and the spiral. So on this pin, you don't need to leave the thing like we did on the double spiral, because we're going to do a different way of making the clasp part on this one, or the catch. So just make the spiral. Now, what I would recommend is before you start making the other parts of the pin is to go ahead and work hard in the spiral at this point, which is where you just hammer it. I'm not going to do that right now because I'm going to try to get through the pin, but it does get easier if you start work hardening certain parts as you go. All right. So the next portion of this is going to be the catch or the clasp of this. And this is where sometimes I have to look at a previous one to remind me, how did I do that? I'm going to open it up so I can see what I did. So this is where I'm bringing up like this. I'm going to make my loop portion be longer than the spiral. And so I'm just bending it like that. This is where I want to get my pliers to bring in that bend and make it tighter. I want to squeeze this together. So that it closes up like that. This is still going to have a little opening here, but you want to get these parts to be next to each other as close as possible. And this is where it's helpful to work harden it a little bit. Now with aluminum really is going to take more than that, but just to get the general idea, so it's as close as it can get. And then take the loop pliers and bend it. Sometimes it will try to have one part of the wire will move differently than the other, and you just work it out with your hands or with your pliers. This is where I want to flatten a little bit. So you can see how it is on the front, and then this is the back. Okay, so the next part of this one is making the S loops. Okay. This is where I'm to make sure that I get things going the right ways. Okay. Okay. So just thinking here. All right, so we're going to make one loop. So I made one loop. Now I'm going to make the other one go the opposite direction. So that's kind of like on that pin, except for the one of the earlier pins we did, except for we put this catch here in the middle. And now we're going to make it be like the fibulas. And we're going to go down here a little ways. We're going to leave a little bit that we want to make for the pin. And we're going to make a loop. And I've seen some period examples where they actually go through and make 2 or 3 loops like this on this portion. So I have it where it's wrapping around so it looks like a safety pin, just a very fancy type safety pin type thing. And then you have your catch that this would go into. And then I'm going to trim off my end, my point that I want. And you can see how this would be easier to hammer it as you're going. And then you have a completed pin. After you go through and file it and hammer everything. But even if you don't hammer as you go, you can always work around it, use the edge of things to hammer, because you're going to want to hammer this portion to make it stronger, as well as this portion, the pin part, and you definitely want to reinforce the spiral and everything. So work hardening will help with all that. So that is the end of the recording part. So I'm going to go ahead and stop that.